First session of the Philosophy and Jurisprudence Society of Hidayatullah National Law University. Very excited, very glad that all of you have joined me here, and hopefully this can be the first of many more sessions, right? Before I start, I really want to bring forth or tell you guys about the effort of two specific people. One is Namanjeet Singh Bhatia, who is the secretary of the club. He's also in my batch, the batch of 2025, and Vrinda Chaturvedi. She is our assistant secretary and she's from the batch of 2026. Both of them helped me a lot, especially designing the brochure. I'm a helpless guy when it comes to aesthetic things like that, and they've helped me a lot. So I just want to mention that, get that out of the way. And here we're going to start with, I'm not introducing philosophy to you here. That's not my goal. I'm just trying to answer the question here, what is philosophy, right? Because you've joined here, but perhaps you even have an idea, right, what philosophy might be, but you don't exactly perhaps know what philosophy is. And I don't know about you guys, but when I was younger, I really liked biology as a subject. No, I loved it. And whenever we came across a new perhaps concept or something, a new term, we always had a look at its etymology, right? And that's the approach I want to take here. I'm not trying to appropriate science and philosophy, that's not what I'm doing, but I just want to use the same approach. Perhaps we can try finding a definition by having a look at the etymology of this word philosophy, and that's exactly what I will do. This word philosophy, right, this comes in existence from the ancient old French word philosophy with an IE, which finds its root in Latin, and that Latin word finds its root in Greece, right? Greece is the birthplace of Western philosophy as we know it. In the second point that you see those funny alphabets there, it's actually Greek, and it stands for philosophia, right? This is coined by Pythagoras, who we study as a mathematician today. Um, but back in his day, in Greece, he was referred to as a philosopher, not a mathematician. We'll get to more of that later in the session, but yeah. Uh, this word, philosophia, right? It's made of two different words, philo or philia, which means to love something or to admire something. In this particular context, it means love. And Sophia stands for wisdom. So, in an etymological sense, we get the idea, okay, perhaps philosophy means love for wisdom or love of wisdom. But when you think about this, right, love for wisdom, this doesn't get us anywhere really when it comes to the definition of this of philosophy, right? Because when you're I mean, this, in a classroom setting, in an academic setting, there's no love going on there. uh, Perhaps it could be argued that there's a pursuit of wisdom, but that's the same with any other discipline. If you're sitting in a biology class, you're pursuing wisdom. In the discipline of biology. If you're sitting in an engineering class, the same for engineering, law, same there. So I don't think we really get anywhere with this idea that, okay, philosophy is either love for wisdom or a pursuit of wisdom. So this doesn't really get us anywhere. But if we have a look at that point that I made, right, an academic setting, right, that I just said, like academic setting, there's no love going on. Perhaps if I say academic setting, perhaps that would refer to an informal setting as well, right? Do you know what I mean? If there's an academic setting, perhaps there's an informal setting as well. And yeah, that actually goes on in today's time, right? Whenever you say philosophy in general to the general public, they'll think, especially in India, that oh, it's an old guy talking about his life, things you're supposed to do in life or something that's good to do in your life, something like that. It's just some wisdom. That's not exactly what philosophy is. There's a distinction that is to be made from that and academic philosophy, and I have done it here. I've tried to make a distinction here. In the first case, which is more informal, right? It's more personal. Philosophy is dealt with something that's more personal. It's more of an individual conception rather, and it's more informal in a sense. Like I've mentioned here, it's an activity people undertake when their goal is to understand fundamental truths. And I want you guys to remember this phrase. We'll come back to this later. Fundamental truths about themselves, the relations they form, the world in which they live in, things like that. This is the informal aspect. But if you have a look at the academic, as an academic discipline, like we know it today, It's more structured, it's more rigorous, it's more ruthless, I'd argue, and at least as juxtaposed with informal philosophy. And it's more systematic. How is this systematic? Because it's dissected, or not dissected, but rather divided into certain major areas of study. But these 2 points that you see in front of you, right, these still don't really help us have a rigorous or a very consistent definition of philosophy, right? And perhaps there is a distinction here to be made again from a description of philosophy and a definition of philosophy. If you've gone through the reading, it was an optional reading anyway, but if you would have gone through that, the author there, Nigel, seems to be more dealing with describing philosophy as some of the questions. He doesn't really deal with defining this discipline. And so let's keep defining or definitional aspect of philosophy at the back of our heads for now. And let's focus more on the major areas of study that we have. Before I go any further, do we have any questions or queries, guys?
None.
Yeah, feel free to unmute and ask if you have any. No? Right, we'll go ahead then. Yeah, major areas of study. Philosophy as we know it today, not as it was before. When I say before, I mean centuries ago. But today we know philosophy as a subject or a discipline that's divided into 4 main subjects, being metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, and logic. We'll deal with metaphysics first, and we'll go in a bit of depth with this. Right? Yeah. Right. So metaphysics really, let's talk about how this word really came about. Right? Metaphysics. Actually, Aristotle, right? In his day, he also wrote a lot on physics, and there was a particular book of his called Metaphysics, and it was directly after his work of physics, right? He wrote a book, it was called Physics, and he wrote another piece of work. And so he didn't name it exactly at that point of time. Later scholars, they started calling this work of his metaphysics, and which quite literally means after physics. And that's how the name metaphysics came about. Questions in metaphysics, generally deal with reality and the nature of reality and reality itself. Some very fundamental, basic question about what really exists in the world. Does the world even exist? Are we in a kind of a simulation, I guess, or what's going on there? What's the order in the universe? Is there any order in the universe or something like that? These are some of the basic questions they deal with. I've focused on 3 here. These are not the only questions in metaphysics, but I felt that perhaps they might give us a very in-depth understanding of metaphysics. Just these 3 questions, right? What is real? What exists? And what is its nature, right? And this second question, right, of what exists, it's so important. It's so important that we have a whole subfield called ontology dedicated to it. Like, take an example, a question of the existence of God, right? Does God exist, right? It's a very important question for us. Of course, to make more sense of this question, to be able to answer this question of does God exist, we might have to inquire about the nature of this being called God, right? What's the nature of God? What is God like? Perhaps that might help us make more sense of this ontological question at hand. So here's the basic idea. Does something exist? That's ontology. It still comes under metaphysics, but you have to be specific here. It's ontology. And when you inquire about the nature of this being or non-being, perhaps, it's metaphysics. I'd like to really elucidate more on this by 2 examples. The first one is through Richard Dawkins. Has anyone heard of Richard Dawkins here? Give me a shout, anyone?
Yeah, he is one of the professors who promoted atheism, right?
Wasn't he the guy who gave the evolutionary theory and all?
Oh, he didn't.
About the evolution.
He didn't give the evolutionary theory. He popularized it, basically, at least in the modern world.
Oh yeah,
yeah. A lot of kids got introduced to atheism and science to this guy. And so in this book, The God Delusion, right? He doesn't assume. He proclaims, right, this question: does God exist? Which you and I right now would call an ontological question, right? He says that no, this is a scientific hypothesis, right? And he very cheekily says, like any other. And I want to really understand this question a bit more deeper, right? Because if this was true, if this was something that would be a scientific hypothesis, we'd be faced with some very, very important and very burning questions. The first would be, well, if the existence of God is a scientific hypothesis, then we'd have to run some kind of observations, right? Some kind of empirical tests. So there has to be some kind of empirical questioning. Dawkins doesn't really go into the depth of answering this question. What would these tests be, right? And I really want to quote a philosopher. His name was Alfred Whitehead, North Whitehead, and he very succinctly said this. And he said, every scientific man, in order to preserve his reputation, something along these lines, has to say that he dislikes metaphysics. What he means is that he dislikes his metaphysics criticized. And that's exactly what's going on here. Dawkins makes a very fundamental and rudimentary metaphysical assumption here. He makes the assumption that human-made tests here would work on a being like God. Right? Because think about it. Don't we assume that the properties of God, or if you're an essentialist, the essences of God are different than a normal human? God is like omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. Why must we assume that human-made tests would work on a being like that? Right? He makes a metaphysical assumption there, which is always pretty funny to me. But anyway, my point here is that Dawkins is really wrong. I don't think we'd really benefit if we just try and reduce questions like these, specific questions like these, to maybe to things, or to the empirical sciences. I think we'd make more progress if we use philosophy or reasoning or argumentation. Because think about it, if Plato is the one we know today is one of the founders, I guess, of Western natural law theory, not natural law theory, but Western natural law theory. With Dawkins' lines of reasoning, we'd have to refute Plato in his nominal work by saying, oh, wait, no, you have no proof of God. You have no proof of the existence of natural law. Bye-bye. None of that natural law. We wouldn't have these interesting, perhaps our seniors must have heard of it here, or the Hart and Fuller debates between natural law and positivism. We wouldn't have that because, well, this is something that the empirical science deals with, right? So we've made more progress by the usage of reasoning and argumentation in these ends. From this example here, right, we're faced with two very burning and important questions. First being, can science and philosophy have similar questions, right? That's number one. And the second question that we have here is, why can't we just use maybe science instead of philosophy if these questions are similar, right? And to answer the first question, I guess, actually, yes. We can have similar questions in these two disciplines, in science and philosophy, but philosophy, where science ends, I guess that's where philosophy begins. It sounds cheesy, I know, but it's pretty much the truth. It goes beyond science. And a good example of this is perhaps causation. If you think about causation, cause and effect, you guys probably heard of it. This is not exactly a question for science. Science doesn't deal with this. A scientist might assume it to be true, or something that's happening, something that's going on, but that's it. He'd end it there. A philosopher, on the other hand, would say, well, does it exist in the first place? You're assuming it to be true, but does it actually exist? That'd be a philosopher's first question. Another question a philosopher might ask is, well, could causation go backwards? Right? Could we have the effect and then the cause? Right? And is this relation here between cause and effect perhaps between objects, or is it between facts, events, ideas? What is this relation here? So that's just a small example. And as for the second question, if these two disciplines can have similar questions, why can't we have science over philosophy? Well, science is built upon philosophical ideas, right? The scientific method that we know today, empirical testing, finds its base in empiricism, which is a philosophical idea. And these are all scientific method and the likes, inductive reasoning. All of these are influenced by philosophy, right? Think of it this way. Think of a big playground, right? And this is where the scientists come and play. Philosophers or philosophy would decide the boundaries of this ground and the floor of this ground. With what kind of grass would it be? So what I'm trying to say is philosophy lays the guidelines upon which scientific inquiry takes place. So it's not like science isn't important, but it's just that I have a problem with this monopolization that science makes all the time, right? Like monopoly on knowledge. I feel it's a very backward thing to do. The second example, well, we dealt with this question, right? Does God exist? Right? We dealt with that. But let's go on to more, more practical questions, I guess, if you want to call them that. How about I say, do moral values exist? Right? Is it something that's objectively out there in the universe, right? And what if I say, and if these are there, what are the properties of right and wrong? What makes an action right and wrong, right? And if I try answering this question, one response could be a divine argument, right? Like perhaps someone would say, well, in this holy book of mine, God says this is bad and this is good, so this is bad and this is good. And he talks about this being right and this being wrong. Another guy might say, oh, well, in my religious book, this is right and this is wrong, so you're wrong. So you get what I'm saying? A religious argument could be a response to that. Another response could be, well, perhaps we could try and reduce actions of any moral action to natural things like happiness, right? Which means basically that rather than wasting time, I guess, on debating questions of right and wrong or trying to elucidate this, why don't we just reduce, say, happiness to something being right or something being wrong? And this is what the utilitarians have sought to do. We studied Bentham, I guess, in our second semester, or I'm not sure if in the first semester, but he was a utilitarian, right? And the idea is that right and wrong could be reduced to the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. Right? And if you could explain happiness and find a method to reduce it to morality, then one doesn't really need a divine explanation. No, why would you need a divine explanation when you explain it through happiness? That's another response. Another last response could be one made by Immanuel Kant. I don't expect you guys to know who he is, but very, very big figure in the history of philosophy, Immanuel Kant. And he's not a reductionist like the utilitarians, right? He doesn't reduce actions to um, features of right or wrong. He is what we'd call a deontologist. You don't need to know what that means, but if you do, perfect. So for Kant, right, there is an objective moral law that exists in and of itself, right? It's objectively out there. It's he contrasts it with religion, right? But so that's how he's differentiating himself with religion. But yeah, and this moral law is distinct from other things, right? And moral actions are all moral actions are to be carried out to this moral law. So yeah, now we have really two questions in front of us again, right? How is philosophy different from religion? Right? Because religion also deals with questions that of philosophy, like for example of right and wrong, right? And our second question is that, well, like you saw here, right? Axiology. Axiology contains something known as ethics. It's pretty obvious what ethics is to everyone here. This question, right? There being properties of right and wrong. It's quite obvious that this is an ethical question. But this flows out from a question of do moral values exist, which is an ontological question. So are these fields within philosophy interconnected in a sense, or are they like distinct like the sciences perhaps? Interconnected but in a very nuanced way. I'll answer the second one first. They are interconnected actually. Don't think of them as specialized fields. Okay, metaphysics is something I want to specialize on, so I don't need to do much of ethics. Of course, you can focus on one subject more than the others, but they're all interconnected. And they help form a proper philosophical system. So for a proper philosophical system, you need a good metaphysics, you need a good epistemology, you need a good axiology or ethics, and all of this is built upon the base of logic, right? And as for the question of can religion and philosophy, how are they different, right? Religion has two main, at least this is what I think, two main differentiating factors. The first one is revelation. Right? In religion, this is a very general theme in most religions, not all. That someone is informing someone or a human about answers to questions of or like that we face in philosophy. This doesn't really go on in philosophy. There's no revelation like that. No one's really revealing any predetermined truths or something. Just you could give the example of Saint Thomas Aquinas, right? He's a religious philosopher, and why is what I'm saying right? Like I could be wrong here, but no, he's actually one of the few exceptions to this. He accepted the Bible as containing truths. He was a very famous proponent of natural law. I guess we study him in our third year, but he tried integrating reason in his arguments instead of just sticking to the Bible. So that's a very interesting approach, but he's an exception. So yeah, that's the thing with revelation and predeterminedness. Generally, religious priests or religion in general has preordained answers to philosophical questions, right? Of course, we might have new problems with the passage of time, as Adam Smith famously says. But the premise to these new answers would always be certain predetermined rules or predetermined truths. But philosophy isn't like that. It's very evolving. There's no restriction per se. So yeah, that's the thing with metaphysics. Any questions? I know I went on a big rumble there, but metaphysics has a lot of depth to it. So, any questions, guys? Or any comments if you'd like to make?
Yeah, so
Yeah, go on.
aren't all religions by default natural law, proponents of natural law school of thought?
In a sense, maybe.
If not, why not?
In a sense, some of them, yeah, most of them, I guess, yeah. But Hinduism is very, very dynamic, really dynamic, really dynamic. In fact, I don't even. At least the philosophical aspect of Hinduism is very dynamic. The Charvak school, right? The Charvakas that we call, they're a famous bunch of materialists who really rejected any the authority of the Vedas or like this ghastly figure made by the Vedas of God, right? They rejected that, and so what they propounded, they didn't really deal much with jurisprudence. So they didn't write much on natural law, but they seemed to be more
Hedonist,
inclined.
basically.
Sorry.
Hedonist, basically.
Yeah, in a sense, you could say they were leaning more towards what we today might call positivism, legal positivism. So yeah, that's an example. I hope I answered your question.
Good. Thank you.
Could you elaborate more upon the reductionist perspective on the question, right or wrong one?
Yeah. So reductionist, I don't mean it in a like bad sense or anything. What they're doing is instead of really what they call wasting time on just talking about abstract ideas of right and wrong, what they meant to do, like Jeremy Bentham, if I think you're in your first year, you might study him in your second semester political science course. What he sought to do was that, or his whole bunch of theorists to call themselves utilitarians, they thought instead of trying to just objectively try and list out good and bad, each and every action should be judged on its happiness factor, on something that can be measured like happiness. So when you do that, there is no really need of any divine explanation or any huge elaboration of right and wrong. If it makes the greatest number of people happy, then boom, it's a good thing. If it makes a large number of people, I guess, unhappy, then it's immoral. So that's the idea of. I'm really cutting out the nuance here. I'm trying to make it as basic as possible so you can understand. So I hope I answered your question.
I had a situation type question. So should I ask it right now or afterwards?
I guess you could ask it now. I don't know. It depends. Go on.
Okay, so I'll ask it. You decide when you want to answer.
Yeah.
Like you said that if it makes the maximum number of people happy, then it is the right decision to make. So, but if that maximum happiness is overshadowed by the unhappiness of one or two people whom the society considers important, then what?
Yeah. So that you're in your first year, right? That's Prabhu. You're Prabhu, right?
Yeah.
I can't see the screen right now. So
Yeah.
Prabhu. Yeah. So in your second term, you're going to come across this theorist called Jeremy Bentham, and he actually has something known as the felsific calculus. It's like a huge mathematical equation, but what he tries to do here is he tries to derive a proper algorithm here, and what he tries to do is that he doesn't deal like there's not like one individual is more important than the rest. He's more of a liberal in these ideas, liberal in that classical liberal as a tradition, and so that won't really work. It's not like if one person is too unhappy, then the rest have to go through his unhappiness. That won't work. If two people are happy and one is unhappy, that won't really matter. What the two people are happy with they'll go ahead with that. So we understood that metaphysics, right? It deals with the question like, what is the case, right? What's out there? What's the case? Epistemology, on the other hand, would deal with this question: what do we know to be the case? See what I did there? There's a difference between what's out there and what we know to be the case. Even if you have a look at the etymology of this word, epistemology, epistem, which is a Greek word, stands for knowledge or understanding, and logia stands for study. So it's quite literally the study of knowledge, right? It deals with questions about, okay, what is knowledge actually? And how do I know this is actually true? Like, this is pure knowledge and this isn't knowledge. How do I know that? These are very basic questions that started off the whole pre-Socratic revolution, if you may. But yeah, so the question that I mentioned here, these are the common questions. Do we know anything at all? What do we know? What do we know about what we know, and how do we know what we know? What might be the basis of true knowledge? So these are some of the questions that epistemology deals with. Another heavy one. If you don't understand, it's completely okay. But we sometimes might hope that what we know actually is the case, right? That's natural, right? If you know something, you might hope it's the actual case. But yeah, sometimes we could know something, right? And this is the problem of induction, it's called in philosophy. We could know something that we don't know that we know, right? There might be something out there that, okay, I know this is not out there. I know this is something that I don't know about. The fact that I know about this fact that I don't know about is called the problem of induction. So I hope this isn't too, I guess this is a bit too much, I guess, in your first session, but yeah, this is called the problem of induction. I guess if some of you are into science here, you must have probably come across this, especially physics enthusiasts, if any here. So we'll also deal with the question like, for example, this is going to sound very basic, but yeah, how do we know 2 plus 2 is 4, right? It's not, or on moral values, right? How do we know what's actually right and wrong? Because we cannot know right and wrong through sensory perception. No, you can't like put your hand out there and feel something's right or wrong, right? You might feel that there is something natural to you, but that doesn't really examine these concepts of right and wrong. So epistemology as a discipline really deals with that, and it also doesn't just deal with knowledge. It also deals with things like opinion, right? Belief, truth, what's false, how do you differentiate false from truths or truths from false? And for example, if I say, it's going to sound very basic, but for the sake of the example, right? I know people have gone to space, right? We already know people have gone to space, but just an example, right? For this to constitute true knowledge, right? There are two points here. First, I have to be able to justify this, right? If someone's gone to space, there has to be some level of justification given. That's number one. Number two has two facets to it. First, it must be a fact, obviously, and I must also believe in this fact. Yeah, it cannot. That's how we differentiate truths from falsehood. That we have to believe in it as well. And for justification, right, in the first point, one would need evidence, some form of evidence, and this is actually the game here. If you recall the point about philosophy laying guidelines for science, this is the game. In terms of science, justification would be through empirical means, or the scientific method. So if anyone of you are aware of the science wars, I don't really expect you to be. It was between like scientific realists, as they call themselves, and postmodern theorists, right? And the scientific realists champion things like objectivity, science, and stuff like that. And the postmodernists generally were very skeptical. I wouldn't say they brushed away the sciences because that would be a bit stupid, but they were very skeptical about the advancements of science and science as a discipline itself. They wanted it to be something under scrutiny instead of something being like a discipline having a monopoly over knowledge itself. So this was the playing ground, the whole battleground of the science wars in the 90s. You can Google that. It's pretty fun, actually. I just want to make a note here that it's not like philosophers just talk about the same thing all the time. It's not like each and every single philosopher talks about, okay, knowledge, this for me is knowledge, okay, this for me is an opinion, okay, this for me is belief. No, philosophy is very dynamic and extensive like that. Epistemology in our context here has different facets, and I want to really highlight this by just briefly mentioning some of the epistemological outlooks of certain philosophers. Let's start with Plato, who we're going to deal with very soon. So Plato attempted to understand what was it to know, like what was it like to know something, right? And how knowledge is good for the person who knows, the knower. And he contrasted this knowledge with opinion. He contrasted knowledge with just mere opinion, as he called it. That was Plato's epistemology. John Locke, on the other hand, who we famously know today as a political theorist and someone who perhaps we might come across in our law classes as well, he tried to attempt to understand the operations of human understanding instead of just knowledge in general. Immanuel Kant, on the other hand, whose example I gave earlier, he's also a huge figure in philosophy. He attempted to understand not the operations but the conditions of the possibility of human understanding. What conditions could lead to the possibility of human understanding, right? Another more very, I guess, modern in the large scene is like from the previous century, but yeah, Bertrand Russell. He attempted to understand like how modern science can be explained or rather justified through sensory experience. He had a whole movement actually that we might touch upon later on. Analytic philosophy, we'll touch upon that later. More recent developments, on the other hand, they seek to understand how our degrees of confidence are rationally constrained by evidence, right? Too many big words, never mind that. What I mean is, like, for example, if you have a look at feminist epistemology, which is really famous now, and it's very recent, here they seem to be attempting to understand the ways in which our interests might affect the evidence we have, right? To gain knowledge, and how there are rational constraints in general. So yeah, these are some of the developments recently going on in this field. I don't think we'll touch much upon epistemology in our sessions, really. Might be a little, but just I thought it would be anyway good to introduce you guys to epistemology. I hope this was clear. Do we have any questions? No questions?
Yeah. Anyone
Yeah.
invested in any sphere of knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
is he an epistemologist?
If you're interested, if you're interested, you could call yourself an enthusiast. But in the modern world, to call yourself an epistemologist, you might need a proper backing of your PhD or some written work. But yeah, if this was ancient Greece, then yes, you would be an epistemologist if you were interested in it. Like, I'm interested in philosophy, but I wouldn't call myself a philosopher. You know what I mean? Knowledge has become more institutionalized now. If you contrast it with the Greek days, this makes sense to you? Am I making sense to you here?
Right.
Yeah.
So empiricism and science are just one part of epistemology, as I understand it. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. That's wrong. It's not the study of value. That's economics. Axiology is the philosophical study of value, right? That's how it's differentiated from other disciplines. And think of it this as in a bracket, and how these values might manifest in our society or physical reality in general. Um, so the idea is that a value, right? It could either be through an action or through an object, right? Never mind, I'll get to that in a while. But the subject matter of axiology, right? It really deals with the meaning, the nature, and perhaps the origin of the notions of value and value judgment, right? In general, when we understand value or axiology, if this is understood through human actions, it's called ethics. And if it's understood through physical traits of an object, it's called aesthetics, right? So in ethics, we study rightness or wrongness of human actions, right? And aesthetics, we study the principles rather of beauty and art and taste. And the recently, which is getting a lot of traction these days, the philosophy of food. It's under aesthetics. So it really concerns itself mostly to beauty and things like harmony. Um, this relation between ethics and aesthetics, right, is through a common link of or a common pursuit of value. In ethics, value manifests itself as right or wrong in terms of human action, like I mentioned. In aesthetics, we call it beauty. Uh, and so, look, the similarity in the scope of, say, ethics and aesthetics is not immediately apparent, right? I had to explain this to you. Uh, Hence, this term axiology, or this grouping together of these two subfields, becomes useful to that end. Somehow helps us systematize and things much more better. And yeah, I've mentioned this like a description of ethics here. I got it off the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and involves systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong behavior. Pretty cool stuff here. So yeah, do you have any questions with axiology? Next matter.
Why are ethics and aesthetics grouped together?
Like, it's because ethics in when value is understood through any human action, it's generally through rightness and wrongness, no? And when value is thought of something as a that manifests itself in a physical trait rather than a human action, it could be things like principles of beauty. Maybe like something looks good, so there's value in that, or something that doesn't look good or tastes good, so there's no value in that. So art theory and stuff comes under aesthetics. So there is value here in different contexts. Do you know what I mean? Or if
Right,
I'm
right.
or am I
So,
going too
what
fast?
art we prefer and what art we find disgusting depends on what value systems we hold.
Yeah,
Is that
I,
the rationale behind?
that could be one. That is one outlook. Generally, it's in the more classical philosophy. Yeah, that's one
Right.
outlook. Yeah. Any other questions, guys? Right. So Next, we have logic. Pretty self-explanatory. I don't really have to um, elucidate, but I will a bit. Uh, See, we since philosophy, right? The peculiar thing about philosophy is that generally philosophers employ like arguments or reasoning or some form of rigorous line of argumentation. Or if you're a Deleuzian, influenced by that postmodernist thinker, study of concepts, right? So it becomes important for us to distinguish like one argument or one line of reasoning from the other, right? Otherwise, anything goes. Really, anything goes. So, and not just that, it's really important to be consistent when we're arguing, and we need to adopt a mechanism that helps us be consistent. So for that end, we have logic. A very easy example to give is with the new change in pattern, right? The 2020 and the 2021 batches here. There's been a huge focus now. It was there before, but it's focused upon now more syllogisms, like in CLAT preparation. Um, Aristotle was the guy who came up with it. Actually, it comes under his large system of Aristotelian logic, as he calls it. Um, so the idea is that logic studies premises, conclusions, arguments, and the likes, and there's different systems of logic. Right? For example, like I mentioned, Aristotelian logic, we have classical logic, extended logic, deviant logic, informal logic. I don't think as a club we'd really focus much upon these, but anyway, uh, the areas of research of logic, right, are very vast. Like we have the philosophy of logic, we have mathematical logic, computational logic, etc., etc. And or if you just want even a quick example, a lot of kids in the first year in a sociology project, they have surveys and stuff, right? Um, so after the collection of the data of the survey, you're supposed to draw conclusions from that data, no? So what you're doing there is you're using the principles of logic. You might not be doing it like you might think, oh, this is so obvious, A, B, and all that, but that's pretty much what you're doing. So logic becomes helpful in that end as well in everyday life. So yes, that's logic. Some questions here. What constitutes good and bad reasoning? How do we determine whether a given piece of reasoning is good or bad? Yeah, so I think it's pretty obvious. Anyone has any questions, go ahead with it. Guess not. Right. Before we go further, now we're on to
Just one point.
yeah, go on. Yeah, please go on.
Reasonings or providing rationale behind formulation of laws. So, in a sense, all schools of laws in themselves, won't they form part of logic?
No,
Because they provide a rationale for why society should be run a certain way.
Right. They might make philosophical assumptions, but what they use is logic. They don't really build logic there. What they're using is pre-existing forms of logic. It's like, think of it like math. If you have a sum in front of you, you're going to use some form of formula, right? Some form of equation on that question. And so the equation here would be logic, and the sum here would be law. Does it make sense to you?
Right. This was actually what I was looking for. Yeah,
Yeah. Perfect. Any other questions, guys? Okay, so now we got done with the dry stuff, right? Describing philosophy. It's pretty dry. Now we get to the real juicy part, if you may. Before we go further, and this is completely on an informal level, you can say pretty much anything you want, but anyone want to try defining philosophy here? Just something out of the blue, even like I don't know. I'm not looking for like a systematic and a very rigorous definition of philosophy, but what do you guys think philosophy is? Does anyone want to go ahead?
The art of making sense.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Anyone else? Anyone else? Only one guy? Come on, guys. Are you guys really shy? Jesus. It's not class, man. My God, it's not class. Don't think of this as I don't know, a lecture or something. I'm just our first session, which is more, I guess, not really discussion based, but our following sessions would be discussion based. So please don't be shy. You could pretty much say anything. No one's really going to laugh at you or anything.
Finding justification for commonplace things.
Justification. What's your name? That's a
Devyani.
Devyani. Nice. Okay, that's a good one. Anyone else?
Naman, people are writing things in the chat, so you might want to read that.
Oh, can you read it for me? sharing the screen. So
Okay, so yeah, Divyani ne to bol diya. Next, Sarah Joy is saying that philosophy is the pursuit of knowing the unknown.
wow, that's knowing the unknown. Yeah, there's some truth to that. That's actually pretty nice. Anyone else?
Then
May I try?
Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead.
I think it might be a clarification between your thoughts and your conceptual knowledge.
Wait, how are thoughts and conceptual knowledge different in your context? I really want to understand. Audible? Naman, Cheet, am I audible?
Yeah,
yes, yeah, you are.
Never mind. Namanjeet, why don't you try, man? Any?
I think I'll stick with the pursuit of wisdom one. So,
Okay, that's nice. That's nice.
mm,
Anyway, look, I won't make you guys feel any more awkward. But look, the really cool thing about philosophy, right? It's a peculiar thing, rather, is that when you try and define philosophy, what you're doing in that moment is philosophy. Like, I'll give an example. Remember the phrase I told you to remember? Fundamental truths here. See that? Fundamental truths about themselves, the world. Here I'm making a grand metaphysical claim, actually. Even though I'm trying my best to not define it here, I was trying to describe it. I make a grand metaphysical claim that there are some fundamental truths out there, right? And that it's our job to understand them. So there's a metaphysical claim there. So what I'm doing there is philosophy. That's a philosophical claim in itself. So yeah, there's that. And actually, it's not just something that's like, I shouldn't have said it. It isn't something that's really idiosyncratic to philosophy, right? If you try and define, I guess even law, we're law students here, right? If you try and define law, you cease to do law at that minute. What you're doing instead is called philosophy, or to be more specific, the philosophy of law. This would even apply to sports, the philosophy of sports, the philosophy of music, philosophy of feminism, if you may, philosophy of, I don't know, biology, which is a great interest of mine, philosophy of science, philosophy of yada yada yada. So when you try and define a particular field or ask questions that we'd call metaphysical, you would have to release yourself from the confines of that discipline, and what you're engaging in is philosophy. But here's the catch, no? It's not just law that has so many definitions, right? We have natural law theorists, we have positivists, we have interpretivists, we have social legal theorists, so many. But it's the same with philosophy. There have been so many definitions of philosophy out there. And yeah, this picture here, actually, I got it off Twitter. It's a running joke that so many centuries of philosophizing and thinking, and we're yet to have one single definition that all of us agree upon. It's pretty sad when you think of it in that way. But yeah, look, because we have so many different takes, right, of philosophy. Sometimes some philosophers, what they do with a certain point of view, philosophers with a certain point of view might accuse other philosophers with different points of view of either being incoherent, or rather saying you're not doing philosophy, right? Or like I told you about the science wars, right? In the science wars, the scientific realists really accuse the postmodernists of pseudo philosophy, right? They're not doing actual philosophy. Even we're going to study them soon. Yeah, the analytic philosophers, they criticize some of the like. Does anyone know Jacques Derrida here? Has anyone heard of this name? I guess not.
yeah, the
Yes.
language guy.
Yeah. He's also very relevant to us as law students. But he was always even now that he's died, people just accuse him of pseudo philosophy. Generally, not just philosophers, even certain political sections of society, like liberals or conservatives. These guys accuse most postmodernist thinkers of doing pseudo philosophy, right? And so, why is this going on? Why do we have so many different takes? Why can't we just have one single definition, right? I guess before we come to that, let's try and understand some of the different definitions. Maybe I'll dumb them down as much as I can. We're not going into super depth here. It's just our first session. So Plato, right? We're going to deal with Plato. And Plato, and this was ancient, right? He was ancient back in the day. He thought of philosophy, right? For Plato, philosophy is something that has to be contemplated. Philosophy is contemplation for him, and the premise of this claim, this argument here, was that he was skeptical of our senses, skeptical of human senses, right? Of course, our senses are helpful in numerous ways, but they have the capacity to deceive us. An example would be, and here, think we have the advantage of modern technology and all the years of I guess progress. But think of yourself being in ancient Greece, right? Long before Christ was born. If you put a pencil in a glass of water, it would appear to you that it's bent, right? It would appear it's bent. Only when you put your hand if you touch the pencil while it's immersed in water, would you realize, oh, it's not bent here. It's actually straight. Perhaps my senses are deceiving me. So that was Plato's rationale, right? So he claimed, okay, instead of looking outside in the material world for answers to philosophy or even understanding philosophy, the definition of philosophy, he said, okay, forget that. What we're going to do here is we're going to look within ourselves to gain access to ideas. And he had a whole like an imaginary world of forms, a theory of forms that he propounded. We'll study that this in this semester. But yeah, there's more nuance that goes into this, but this is the basic gist. And if you're interested in Plato, if you want to read this in your spare time, he really elucidates about the skepticism of senses in his work Parmenides. Right, you could check that out if you like. That was Plato. Now, I want you to have a look at the second theorist, this book from the top, Deleuze and Guattari, right? What is philosophy? His name is Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Deleuze was a philosopher and Guattari was a psychoanalyst. And very, very idiosyncratic pairing. But this book, right, second one from up top, it was written in like, I guess 1991, I think. So it's like, it's 3 decades ago, sure, but in the history of philosophy, it's very modern. It's a very modern outlook. And the main claim that these both seek to make is that, philosophy is actually just a process of concept creation, right? And this was actually a bit, it might seem obvious for now, but it was a bit revolutionary. It's still very revolutionary in that since antiquity or ancient Greece, philosophers contended, right, that there is some form of preordained order out there, or some set of truths out there that we just have to discover. And okay, to give you a more practical example, I guess, some of the capitalist philosophers or the classical liberal tradition, right, the Enlightenment liberals, right, they held that the goods of capitalistic production rest upon this presupposition that Newtonian induction, you don't have to know what that means, it's a Newtonian concept, and the so-called experimental method are apt in discovering the truths of humanity. Right? They never really questioned about the existence of these truths in the first place. They just took it as a given, right? And this is very revolutionary in that they say, wait, no, we don't discover things out there, right? Philosophy isn't a process wherein we go out there and discover something. It's a process where we create. Something is created out of nothing. So, for example, if we try and say that, okay, we are discovering something out there, then of course we would have a huge distinction, a strong distinction between, okay, something is right and something is wrong, because, well, it's out there, it's discovered. But when you create something, right, if it's a process of concept creation, we won't really get far with calling it right or wrong, because there's that element of human interpretation there, right? So the argument could be either more contextually fitting or maybe less adequate. So instead of having right and wrong in those strict distinctions. And so, of course, with concept, it was a very nuanced idea what Deleuze and Guattari were trying to say there. And I'm not really going to go much into that, but just to give you a small taste of it, a concept is like an abstraction, right? You see that book there, it's white in color, it has white, right? There's white there. You have chalk, that's also white. Like a marble flooring, that's also white. A whiteboard or a piece of paper. These are all white. But we know these are different shades of white. So perhaps that concept of white is what we're trying to point towards instead of that actual color or shade of white. So that's what they meant by concept. And lastly, Heidegger, right? Martin Heidegger, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The seventh one book from up top. Martin Heidegger, right? And he used 2 very heavy words to describe philosophy, and he actually called it universal phenomenological ontology. You don't need to know what that means. By that, what he meant was that philosophy, right, is the study of existence from the point of view of the subject, right? What do you mean by subject? Subject here would refer to a person, or to be a bit more specific, a person who engages in inquiry, or philosophical inquiry, right? And Heidegger thought that, okay, well, this was in stark contrast to Plato, okay? That, well, we can't just access universal truths by just thinking about stuff. That's not how stuff really works, right? That was the main line of reasoning. And I guess a lot of us here would be aware of existentialism. That's cool. So Albert Camus, Sartre, um, and all of those guys, they were all influenced by Heidegger and this line of reasoning. So that's a pretty cool point. And then yeah, I guess that'll be the three different takes on philosophy. Now the question really is, I gave you a small taste of what are the different ideas people have about philosophy. The question is, why still do we have so many takes, right? And this is the end, I guess, of our this is the end of our session, just last 10 minutes. And well, yeah, of course, if you have different conceptions of reality, if you have a different metaphysics, of course you're going to have a different take, right? And this isn't just limited to philosophy. If you have a different conception of law, of reality, that would even influence how you think about the law. So that's how we might have different conceptions of law as well. That's one reason. Another reason could be, well, if you have a different huge system of philosophy, you cannot expect another guy who has a different view of, has a different system he subscribes to or has created. You cannot expect both of these guys to have the same outlook. Another reason, which is pretty obvious, is that different contexts, different societies, different times, right? Where a person who had a thought of philosophy 1,000 years ago and who might think of philosophy today, they might have different ideas of philosophy, right? And not just that, that's time. Even different societies, one might be living in a Western country, one might be living in a third world country. Where they're living might influence how they think, right? Perhaps. And lastly, we have historical context. So remember I told you, like, today I always focused on today. Philosophy is known as 4 major areas of study. I was focusing on today because back in the day, like ancient Greece, all of knowledge was philosophy, right? So what we call biology today, physics, geometry, astronomy, all of these disciplines came under philosophy. That's why Pythagoras, right? He dealt with not just mathematics, he dealt with ethics, metaphysics, mysticism, music theory, aesthetics, what we call, even natural philosophy, it was called, biology and physics and all that. Newton, right, who we get bored of today in our physics classes, he was never referred to as a physicist in his time. He was actually the professor of natural philosophy at Cambridge, and his magnum opus, or his main book, was the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. So yeah, now we have, with the with the advent of modernity and capitalism and movements like Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, we've started to make certain distinctions between, okay, science and philosophy, sure. Even theology is separate from the humanities, right? This distinction between the divinity and the humanity subjects, or theology subjects and humanities subjects. So knowledge isn't, in general, it's starting to get more specific and specialized. So perhaps that could also be a reason for why we have so many different takes. Any questions before we go to this? This is our last major point. Any questions?
Can we consider scientific inquiry to be a subset of philosophical inquiry?
If you're asking that to me, absolutely. I like to think of philosophy as, in an ancient way, that all of this knowledge comes under philosophy. But if you ask someone maybe out there, then they'd probably disagree. Now there's a stark distinction here. Back in the day, metaphysics, right, the study of the nature of reality, it's starting to get overshadowed by science, because, well, but when you're doing metaphysics, you're not really dealing with any evidence. You might, if you're a certain form of philosopher, who we're going to study analytics soon, but generally you don't provide any empirical data for the same. You use reasoning and arguments. And at the start of the 20th century was when things started to change. Metaphysics started to lose its real value. Even in America, law and metaphysics was a hugely popular approach. It started to lose its followers. So yeah, there is that distinction there. But yeah, generally philosophers nowadays deal with more abstract things, I guess. They might deal with real world issues, right? For example, they might analyze a political system of a place and how it impacts people. But I guess most people think of it as more abstract, and science as something more empirical based. So yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
You mentioned this person who was accused of promoting pseudo philosophy. So, what exactly was pseudo philosophy?
Oh no, I don't accuse him. I really like Jacques Derrida. I really like Jacques Derrida, but
People accused him, right?
yeah, people accused him. The main accusation was he was you see in front of you like continental philosopher. We're going to study that in depth, but he was a continental philosopher, and it's mostly analytic philosophers and scientific realists. They accused him of pseudo philosophy because they said that, well, he uses too many big words. His all of his work is theoretical. He uses too many big words. We can't understand what he's saying. And actually, you know what? The fact that we can't understand what he's saying means that what he's saying isn't really coherent anyway. So let's not pay attention to him. That's pseudo philosophy. That's just a small gist of what they accused him of. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Anything else, guys? Right. Okay, so this is a major reason for, I guess, not just different outlooks to philosophy, but just philosophy in general. This split here, this analytical and continental split, right? As it's mentioned here, at first this split was something that was locational. This means that generally English philosophers from English-speaking nations, or rather the Anglo-Saxon sphere, from the United Kingdom and the likes, like Ireland, United Kingdom, Scotland, and all these philosophers, they refer to themselves as analytic philosophers, and in a very condescending manner, called anyone as different from themselves as continental philosophers. And continental philosophers generally were from countries like France, Europe, Germany, and the likes. So at first this was a locational thing, but now it's become more of a method, like the different methods, approaches they take towards philosophy in general, right? And well, this is actually really contended even to this day. It's so crazy. I was actually in preparation for this session. I was reading this piece by a philosopher called William Blackburn, and he is a professor at Georgetown University. He claims that this split is actually not real. So there's still a lot of debates and fiery debates within these philosophers from these different camps. But yeah, I'll try and give you very basic and very easily readily available features that you can distinguish these both from. The analytics or the analytical philosophers, they tend to focus more on analysis in general. So analysis of what? Analysis of thought, of mind. The philosophy of mind as a discipline is like completely analytical now. Language is a huge it's something that's very recurring in analytic philosophy. I'll give you an example later on. Logic, they are very heavy on logic and the likes. And these guys tend to solve philosophical problems, right? Like if you have a big philosophical problem in front of you, what an analytical philosopher would do is he would take that problem and start reducing them to smaller parts and try and learn the answers to these smaller parts and how they relate to each other, right? Neil Levy, you don't need to know who that is, but this philosopher claims that analytical philosophy is more of a problem-solving activity than it is philosophy, actually. It's not as a contemplative thing or anything. It's more where people solve problems. Continental philosophy, on the other hand, like I told you about analytics, they take the big picture and break it down into smaller parts. Continental philosophers don't really do that. They focus more on the larger pictures. So this is not to say that they don't deal with particular small issues. They of course do that, but they understand these issues as part of larger unities, or they properly understand smaller issues and they deal with them only when they fit into these big unities. So that's with continental philosophers. They are also more synthetic, or rather more integrative in terms of their methodology. They try and integrate things more. What do they integrate it with? Things like literature or some of the humanities traditions, which is why most continental philosophers in English-speaking nations like United Kingdom and the United States of America, they're more influential in what you and I would call arts departments or humanities departments. Most of the philosophy departments are filled with, at least the major ones are filled with analytical philosophers. It's only in languages in other nations like France or Germany that continental philosophers really hold the places of major philosophy departments. So you see this gentleman on the right, right? This guy. He is the guy we discussed like previously, Heidegger, right? And we understood his view of philosophy as phenomenological ontology, right? He was a continental philosopher, right? And just I'm going to give you a small example of how these guys are different. For him, being, right, this ontological concept of being, you're existing there, this precedes knowledge itself, right? And that phenomena, right? Phenomena, he calls it phenomena. It means the contents of human experience. This must be studied prior to any logical categorization. Right? This would make more sense when we understand the guy to his left, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Yeah, he thought that conceptual or logical problems that we've previously dealt with in philosophy, they were actually just mistakes in about language, right? And these problems that were created by stepping beyond the limits of language or through semantically misguided statements that confuse the logic of language are to be dissolved by analysis of the proposition in question. So look, the main idea here is that for him, language shapes reality. In his main magnum opus Tracticus, Ludwig Wittgenstein said that. So just to give you a quick example, and I mentioned this in my English says in my first year, so take it with a pinch of salt, I guess. So I live in Kuwait, right? If you take a native Arab speaker from here, and if you take a native English speaker, and you both show them a shade of blue called berry blue, right? Not blue, berry blue, and you ask them, okay, tell me which color is this? What will follow is that the English-speaking individual would say, yeah, that's berry blue, right? Okay, perfect. But the Arabic-speaking or the native Arabic speaker would say, well, that's azraq, which is Arabic for blue. He won't say berry blue because there's no word for berry in Arabic. So the idea is that this is just a small example, but when you extrapolate this idea and apply it to the entirety of human existence, the idea is that our language really shapes our reality. Because when you think about it, when you don't have the word to describe something, sometimes you're not able to really even conceive of it. Right? Am I making sense to you guys here? Are you able to understand what Wittgenstein was really on about? Any questions here in this split? This is a very important split that we need to know. Any questions? Nope. Well, that's perfect. And lastly, this is the last one. Well, you gave us such a long lecture, Naman. We're bored. It's a Sunday. Why are we studying philosophy, right? What's the point of this? I had like 10 different points, but I just tried making do with 4. I'll end it very quickly now. When we study philosophy, right, what really motivates this study is not just answering or making arguments or being rational or whatever that is. Sometimes you want to really know whether this argument is right. Is this answer true? Is this argument right? That drives philosophy. And many of the questions and issues in various areas of philosophy that we have, they overlap not just in philosophy, but other disciplines as well, right? And I want you guys to hold this thought. We're going to come to it soon in philosophy as a meta-discipline, right? And philosophy really deals with questions no other discipline really bothers with, right? How's that? Morality, ethics. Religion, sure, sometimes deals with ethics, but it's very restrictive. Philosophy isn't restrictive. It has always room for new perspectives. Science helps us learn new things, but not questions of ethics, right? Not what is right or wrong. Economics focuses, sure, on wealth creation and value, but that's in the context of wealth creation. Doesn't really talk about if that is moral or not. Of course, we also have logic, rules that govern the scientific method, mathematical proofs, political arguments, legal arguments, statistics, all of them flow out from logic. And of course, concepts like truth and knowledge, what really is true. No other discipline really deals with that. Philosophy is a meta-discipline. Yeah. So this really brings me back to the point Sarah made. But most of our disciplines, they engage with the contours of human knowledge. But philosophy, the cool thing about this is that it goes to the edges as well. It really pushes the boundary. So if we conceive of philosophy, if we conceive of it as something that deals with things that we immediately don't know, it then leads us to mainstream disciplines, right? And in that context, philosophy could be used as a meta-discipline, right? By metadiscipline, it means that it can engage with other disciplines as well, question its methods and assumptions, and broaden its horizons. And that's how philosophy becomes relevant to us as law students, right? We could use it to as a metadiscipline to question some of the basic assumptions of what we have as law students or legal academics in general. So yeah, and the thing with philosophy of law, yeah, I just really wanted to clear this up. I really was annoyed with this in my first semester. Legal philosophy, jurisprudence, and philosophy of law, right? What's the difference between all of these three? Everyone uses it interchangeably. It's so annoying, right? And well, I don't have a one step objective answer to that. I really don't. But for the sake of our society, we'd think of analytical jurisprudence and we'd use it interchangeably with legal philosophy and philosophy of law. Why? Because in analytical jurisprudence, we deal with more metaphysical questions of law, right? It'll get us more to legal philosophical questions, right? What is law? What is the nature of law? Stuff like that. Normative jurisprudence is what goes on mostly when you, I don't know, read papers online, stuff like it's more deals with systems of law, like for example, medical jurisprudence, constitutional jurisprudence, international law, philosophy of international law, and the likes. And so some of the weapons that we gain, or some of the tools that we gain from philosophy, could be used in normative jurisprudence. Just a small anecdote. I actually noticed this even in our constitution. A friend of mine as well, actually, that there's something, the basic structure theory, right? All of us know what the basic structure theory is actually very similar to Aristotle's metaphysics, what he calls material and form. You don't need to know what that is, but there is a stark similarity there, actually. And even fundamental duties or fundamental rights that we know, they can be found in the works of Cicero or Cicero, I guess, the Greek philosopher. So there's a lot of interesting things to be learned, or new perspectives to be gained when we integrate philosophy and law. And that's the goal here with this society.